Hi everybody, thank you for joining us for this 6th or 7th MarSocSci webinar. I'm Emma McKinley, for those of you who don't know me. I'm the chair of the Marine Social Science Network, and we've been running these webinars over the last 12 months or so, covering a real range of topics, including blue growth, stakeholder engagement in marine protected areas, the use of arts and arts-based methods in how we understand the relationship between people and coast and sea and ocean. If you've missed any of our previous webinars, you can find them all on our website and on our YouTube channel. Today's speaker is Dr. PeterJones from University College London. He is a reader in the Department of Geography, and he is going to be talking to us about governing MPAs. So I'm going to hand over to Peter now. And I'll let you head off, Peter.
Okay, thanks very much, Emma, and great to see so many people joining this webinar this afternoon. I've been doing research now on marine protected areas, particularly all the research revolving around governance now for 30 years. So I guess I must find it interesting, and I hope I can share some of the fruits of my 30 years of obsessing on MPA governance with you this afternoon. So what I'm going to talk about this afternoon is this most recent paper. It focuses on the governing MPAs, looks at the challenges of decentralization in the shadow of hierarchy. A lot of this work draws on this book, and I'm not here to sell this book, but if you do want a copy of the book, if you use that discount code, you'll get a 20% discount. So what does this governing MPA's challenges of decentralization in the shadow of hierarchy, what does it mean? To put it more simply, how can we influence the behavior of people who use marine resources in a way that fulfills both resource use and marine conservation priorities? Incidentally, I should mention that if you want to follow the slides or get a PDF afterwards, slides of the presentation are available on my website and on Twitter at this tag. So the simplest definition of what does to govern mean is it means to steer. It's actually derived from the ancient Greek verb to steer, and it was first used in this context by Plato. So we've been talking about governance for a long time. And there are three key sources of governance steer that are recognized. We have top-down state control, markets through economic instruments, assignation of property rights, etc. And we have bottom-up governance, participation and the empowerment of local people. And there's growing recognition in governance debates that there is a need to move beyond ideological arguments as to which of these approaches is best or right, and develop governance models, frameworks and approaches that combine the role of states, markets and people. And this awareness was heightened after the financial crash of 2008-2009, because one of the main factors behind that crash was a lack of government regulation of markets. So there is this resurgence of interest in the role of the state in governance, albeit a reconfigured role of the state. The role of the state is itself evolving, but it remains important alongside these other two sources of steer. So broadly speaking, let's move the debates on how can we combine governance approaches. So in the book and in this research, we define governance appropriately enough as steering human behavior through combinations of state, market, and civil society approaches in order to achieve strategic objectives, which obviously in this context are the objectives for marine protected areas. We also use this term resilience a lot, borrowed from engineering. Roughly speaking, it's the capacity for stability in the face of potentially perturbing forces. So our potentially perturbing forces in governance are things like climate change, population growth, globalization, and the spread of markets. These are all the driving forces, perturbing forces that can perturb a governance system and thereby the related ecosystem. So with these two definitions in mind, the question is, how should we go about steering human uses of marine protected areas in order to make them effective and equitable, and build resilience to climate change and other potentially perturbing environmental and human influences. Now, to cut a long story short, we used to have top-down hierarchical governance, command and control in the context of protected areas, often referred to as fortress conservation. And we're not going back there. In 1968, we had this rather distracting episode, Garrett Hardin's Tragedy of the Commons paper, in which he concludes that the state lacks the capacity and reach to manage the commons. So his conclusion was privatise the commons through enclosure to unleash the invisible hand of economic rationality, as freedom in the commons brings ruin to us all. It's still, I wasn't going to include this slide. I regret the fact that any Governance 101 lecture starts off with Garrett Hardin, because it was all rather vague and suspect in terms of its morality. But it's a useful milestone to think about how thinking has evolved on governance. More importantly, along came Eleanor Ostrom in 1990 and said, no, it's not about a choice between top-down and markets. There's a third way, bottom-up, polycentric governance. So this is all about place-based self-governance of common pool resources. And I'm guessing that this is probably the theoretical perspective that most of you are familiar with, or most familiar with. And this has been translated into an empirical framework called the social-ecological systems framework. And again, to cut a long story short, there are two problems with this framework that I found. I've tried to use this framework in marine protected area governance case studies, and I struggled because it assumes that ecosystems can be divided into discrete places that can be self-governed by local actors, actors just being a generic term for people, drawing on their local knowledge, which sounds fine, but what is any marine protected area, for instance, a discrete place, an autonomous place? All these places, arguably, are connected through human and ecological factors. Ecological, given the scale and complexity of marine ecosystems, and human in terms of the growing scale and demand of sectors like tourism, fisheries, etc. So no MPA is an island. They're not discrete places. So that's the first assumption that makes this framework problematic. And the second assumption is these vertical and horizontal linkages. These should act purely as channels for cooperation, deliberation, negotiation, and conflict resolution amongst actors within and between different places. But, and this is an important but, with no state interference. These linkages should emerge from the bottom up and purely as channels for cooperation, deliberation, negotiation, and conflict resolution. There is this tremendous faith that they will resolve conflicts within places and between places, conflicts over competition for resources, basically. But again, is this realistic, given the competition within and between places for access to and the utilisation of natural resources? I've had to skip through this quite quickly, but we expand on this at considerable length in the supplementary material to the paper. So I'm a great fan of Eleanor Ostrom. My research framework was inspired by her systematic approach to case study research, but I just couldn't apply the social-ecological systems framework in a way that seemed to match the realities of marine protected areas. Because essentially polycentrism, took me years to work this out. Polycentrism means decentralization, but it's decentralization with the assumption that governance has swung from the old days of top-down to the new days of entirely bottom-up, with no state interference whatsoever. An important principle running through a lot of Eleanor Ostrom's work is the state should not interfere It should be a passive provider of sanctions and facilitator of local deliberations, but it must not interfere. And again, I question whether this is the reality. If you go out and look at marine protected areas, the state is everywhere. Local people are everywhere and market forces are everywhere. So to focus purely on one source of steer and to rule out any interference by the state, again, I question whether that's realistic. So we developed this concept of coevolutionary governance because we need to move beyond the top-down monocentric or bottom-up polycentric dichotomy. We need to move beyond this top-down or bottom-up to recognize the role of the state in coevolutionary governance through a combination of incentives in the shadow of hierarchy. Don't worry, I'm going to unpack some of these terms subsequently. But essentially what we've tried to develop through this coevolutionary governance concept is a realist institutional analysis framework, as it's known in academic circles. So the idea behind coevolutionary governance is really quite simple in terms of top-down and bottom-up approaches. We have feedback from the bottom-up, participation and institutional learning. So any rules and conditions that are set by the state are adapted in the light of experiences and feedback from local contexts. So that's the bottom-up feedback element of it. We also have this top-down negotiated compliance, whereby rules and conditions, regulations, etc., are negotiated, contextualized, and flexibly adapted to a given place, which in this case is a given marine protected area. But this decentralization remains in the shadow of hierarchy. And I've become quite fascinated by this shadow of hierarchy concept, so I'm going to expand on it a little. Shadow of hierarchy is a very important theme in governance, particularly when we're talking about decentralization. And my wife recently came across mention of it in this Alfred Russel Wallace book from 1869, in which he talks about how Malay Islanders from diverse cultures lived peacefully without the shadow of a government, as they collectively recognized that order was needed to enable them to trade. Their disputes could be judged and sanctions applied by a once yearly visiting Dutch commissioner. So arguably the shadow of hierarchy was still cast, but interestingly, they recognized that it was in their collective best interest in order to lucratively trade. The Malay Islands were a center of international trade at the time. So they knew it was in their collective best interest to abide by collective rules. But there was always this recognition that if there were free riders and problematic actors in the local governance context, that these could be referred to the Dutch commissioner. So it's an interesting that this idea of the shadow of hierarchy was being discussed back in 1869, which more recently, Elinor Ostrom, in her book Governing the Commons in 1990, recognized that successful negotiations can be encouraged by the shadow of the court, based on some earlier work that was done on the case of divorce, how divorcing couples are more likely to reach an amicable settlement if they know that if they don't, it's going to end up in court and it's going to cost them a lot of money and they'll have no control over the outcome. So it's this idea of negotiations encouraged by the shadow of the court, which Elinor Ostrom herself constructively recognized in her writing in Governing the Commons. And being an academic, I have to trace it all back to whence it came from. But I first came across it in this book by Bell and Hinmore, Rethinking Governance in 2009. But the term was first used in 2003 by Whitehead, this shadow of hierarchy term. But a lot of people go back to this reference by Schorpf in 1994, which is about embedded negotiations. And what does this embeddedness mean? Well, I'm going to explore that now by bringing in another concept And it's this wonderful concept of multi-level governance. Multi-level governance is quite straightforward. I'm going to introduce this idea of multi-level governance as a broad political science framework for this sort of work, in which we have accommodated our concept of coevolution. So multi-level governance, we have two sorts of initiative. We have type 1 multiple level governance, which is a fairly predictable and recognizable hierarchical system. So we go from the local to the national, to the regional, to the international level, and we have different sectors of policy. So far, so good, quite straightforward. This is type 1 MLG framework. We now see MPAs as what are known as type 2 multi-level governance initiatives that are embedded within this type 1 MLG framework. So our marine protected area is now a cross-sectoral emergent type 2 governance initiative. It has higher vertical connections to embed the MPA in higher level state institutions from the provincial to international state levels. So these could be obligations, designations under the World Heritage Convention, designations under the Habitats Directive back in the good old days in the UK. So the MPA remains connected through these rules and conditions and obligations to the higher state institutions. But importantly, it has lower vertical connections to embed the MPA amongst local users, amongst local government, amongst local communities. So the MPA is both upwardly and downwardly embedded within its within this type 1 governance hierarchy. And we have coevolution everywhere. So we have coevolution in terms of this top-down negotiation and adaptation and flexibility, and bottom-up in terms of this institutional learning, feedback, participation. So that's the vertical coevolution. But obviously we also need intersectoral integration. So the government ministry that designates the marine protected area need the functions of other government ministries that are in oversee pollution, coastal development, farming, shipping and ports, energy projects. The functions of all these other sectoral authorities have to be integrated. So this is the horizontal dimension of coevolution. So it's great, we've got Wallace bringing in his idea of the shadow of government, and now we're drawing on Charles Darwin's concept of coevolution. So coevolutionary governance, the underlying concept behind this research, addresses the dilemma of whether institutions should be built from the bottom up through self-governance, as the polycentric concept considers they should be, or from the top down through state imposition, as the now rejected monocentric concept considers they should be. Instead, institutions co-evolve through interactions of top-down and bottom-up processes. So you can see the recurring themes here: coevolution, combining different governance approaches through this concept of coevolutionary governance, which we emphasize is a progressive reinterpretation of polycentrism. I think it is time to move to evolve the concept to current dilemmas and challenges and the realities of marine protected areas in the majority of cases. So this alternative concept of coevolutionary governance is more realistic and progressive. It rejects the command and control approach inherent in top-down approaches, but it accepts that some degree and form of state coordination in the shadow of hierarchy is necessary in order to achieve wider scale, longer term strategic societal objectives. For example, MPAs. So we have targets for MPAs, 10% at the moment. There's talk of it rising to 30%. I think that's a bit ambitious, maybe 20% might be more realistic. We need to avoid the tendency towards paper parks and green land grabbing. But nonetheless, we have these long-term strategic societal objectives to restore marine ecosystems, restore fisheries, and to put in place networks of effective and equitable MPAs. So the shadow of hierarchy in terms of these legal targets and obligations arguably must have some influence on what's happening in individual MPAs. So now we're seeing MPAs as synergizing top-down and bottom-up approaches. Both bottom-up and top-down approaches each have their strengths, and these can be summarized in relation to 9 key dimensions of governance. And I don't have time to go into the detail of all this today, but we expand on it in the supplementary material, table 3 of the supplementary material. So to cut a long story short, we have these 9 dimensions of governance. So here we have scale, objectives, participation, transparency and accountability, and knowledge. Bottom-up MPAs have their strengths in these respects, but so do top-down MPAs. And we come on to look at equity, enforcement, resource development and funding. And again, bottom-up MPAs have their strengths in these respects, but so do top-down MPAs. And in the table in the supplementary material, we expand on the corresponding weaknesses. But what this perspective again highlights is the need to combine top-down and bottom-up approaches, providing for synergies where the strengths of one approach counteract the weakness of the other. So one of the questions that's been posed in relation to this seminar is, well, what happens if MPAs are too bottom-up? Well, broadly speaking, they run foul of the risks of localism, or what some development writers talk about in terms of the tyranny of localism. It still surprises me how people assume that if you make governance entirely bottom-up, they assume that everything will be fine. But in fact, there's tremendous potential for injustices through the capture of local governance by dominant social groups, particularly elites, potentially undermining equity for marginalized social groups through this tyranny of localism. And also, local actors sometimes cannot resolve conflicts amongst themselves, or particularly with incoming users. And the incoming users could be state-backed sectors like tourism, industrial fishing, renewable energy projects. These are state-backed sectors that the state's very enthusiastically supporting. But if we don't have the state as an active partner in our MPA, then they may well be sponsoring and promoting, or at the very least permitting, these potentially conflicting developments. So another risk of if you have too bottom-up an MPA is that potentially leads to a business as usual focus on economic development, undermining effectiveness. So too bottom-up, it can undermine equity and it can undermine effectiveness. Too top-down, and we run the risk of the tyranny of the state, potentially undermining equity, particularly if the state is captured by one of our potentially conflicting sectors, such as corporate tourism, energy projects, mining, agriculture. Just because it's being driven by the state doesn't mean that the state itself hasn't been captured. Dare I say it, even state corruption. But at the very least, the state will have very key strategic economic development priorities and infrastructure development priorities. And these can sometimes conflict with a marine protected area. So we run the risks that if it's too top down of this tyranny of the state undermining equity. But there's also the risk that local actors lose ownership of and willingness to cooperate with the MPA governance, at best leading to apathy, but more likely leading to alienation and possibly even resisting and defying state controls, potentially undermining effectiveness. So if it's too bottom up, we have the risks of localism. If it's too top down, we have the risks of imposition. You're getting the pattern here, I'm sure. So the state has crucial roles to play in both ensuring that effectiveness in achieving conservation objectives and equity in promoting fairness are not undermined by the risks of localism, whilst minimizing the risks of imposition. And this again highlights the need to recognise that the state is more than a passive actor and must sometimes provide indirect steer in a manner that minimises the risks of imposition and the risks of localism in order to provide for effective and equitable governance in the shadow of hierarchy. So to the end of that conceptual section, it's widely recognised in policy circles, in MPA management circles, that design and management of MPAs must be both top-down and bottom-up. We were told in this IECN guidance this in 1999, usually through some form of co-management. But what does this actually mean in practice? Co-management is a very broad term. It can mean anything from consulting local users, from some people's perspectives, to entirely bottom-up. So co-management is too broad a term to be a concept that we can apply on an analytical and I think prescriptive basis. So we come back to this key question, what does top-down and bottom-up mean? Through this MPA governance project to research. And in the latest paper, we've explored it through 28 case studies in 15 countries. We have now a total of 50 MPA governance case studies in 24 countries within the project, but I'm just going to focus on these 28 case studies in 15 countries from this latest paper. So the MPAs come from a variety of countries. It's not a random sample, but it's a reasonably representative sample. There's only 27 MPAs on this map because one of the case studies is looking at high seas, the governance of high seas MPAs for area biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. It's looking at that in a general emerging policy framework sense. So we have 27 site-specific case studies. Now, there's an Amish saying that a great deal of what we see depends on what we are looking for. And we need a way of looking at MPA governance that can see all the issues and all the governance approaches that are being used therein. And when studying governance systems, our eyes can easily be deceived in the same way as these puzzles deceive our eyes. So these lines are straight and parallel, but it's not until we put some sort of an objective framing device in that we can see that. These brown circles are the same diameter, but again, we can't see that until we put an objective framework to look at it through. And the idea of the MPAG analytical framework is that it is a way of looking at an MPA that, if you like, forces us to consider all the different governance approaches, rather than looking for what we expect to see or what we want to see. So for a sociologist, we look for the community-based approaches. The economist comes in and looks for the market approaches. The lawyer comes in and looks for the top-down approaches. What this framework tries to do is take those disciplinary lenses off our eyes and give us a lens to look at the MPA through that will bring all the elements of governance and different governance approaches into focus. So again, I don't have time to go into the detail of this. We describe it in detail in the supplementary material to the paper. But the heart of this is these objectives, conservation and operational objectives, we divide them into. We have these driving forces and conflicts, which are the sectoral activities that are leading to impacts. We have the overall governance framework approach, and the fulcrum of the framework is this effectiveness assessment, the degree to which these conservation objectives have been achieved by reducing the impacts of human uses. And how do we reduce the impacts of human uses? We change human behavior through a combination of these 5 categories of incentives. And the framework also considers particularly how incentives interact and are combined. And we have a number of cross-cutting themes. So again, I refer you for the detail to the supplementary material, but this is the MPAG analytical framework, if you like, the empirical framework that operationalizes from a research perspective this concept of coevolutionary governance, this idea of decentralization in the shadow of hierarchy. So to analyse the diversity of approaches that MPAs employ, we developed a typology of 36 incentives. I prefer to call it a taxonomy. I was originally a biologist, and you can't shake off the idea of a taxonomy. So we talked before about 3 governance approaches. So we have 10 economic incentives, which represent the market approach. We have 10 legal incentives, which obviously represent the top-down approach. And we have 10 participative incentives that represent the bottom-up approach. And we also have these interpretative or communication incentives, which are essentially about awareness raising. We have 3 of these. And we have knowledge, i.e. collective learning incentives. And we have 3 of these. So these 2 approaches support all 3 sources of steer. So this is how this idea of different sources of steer is operationalized through this taxonomy of 36 incentives. The detail of the taxonomy is here. Again, I would refer you to the paper to look at the detail therein. But let's think about what an incentive is. It's a particular type of institution that's instrumentally designed in relation to an MPA to encourage actors, i.e. people, to choose to behave in a manner that provides for certain strategic policy outcomes, particularly conservation objectives, to be achieved. So this is at heart a human behavior approach. We use incentives to modify human behavior, those humans being fishermen, people that build hotels, the people that take decisions about where the hotels are built. It's all about people. So the heart of this is how can these incentives change the behavior of people working in combination to effectively and equitably govern our MPA. And we take a synecology perspective on coevolutionary governance. Synecologists look at how species from different trophic groups interact with each other. We take a similar approach. We look at how incentives from these 5 categories interact, co-evolving and working in combination. So it's this idea of synecology that we've borrowed from ecology and brought into this institutional analysis. And when we consider this synecology perspective and focus on how incentives interact with each other, the distinction between top-down, bottom-up and market approaches becomes blurred, if not irrelevant, as increasingly you recognize the need to combine incentives based on all 3 approaches, including the cementing role of participation, economic communication and knowledge incentives, and the reinforcement role of legal incentives. And I often use the metaphor of steel reinforced concrete here. You can't build the building out of the steel reinforcement rods, but nor can you build the building just out of the concrete without the reinforcement, because it won't be structurally stable and resilient. So you combine the cementing role and the reinforcement role. So drawing all this together then, and bringing in some of the findings of these case studies, now looking at a synecology and coevolutionary perspective, what key attribute confers stability in ecosystems? Ecologists used to argue about this a lot, but they don't argue about it anymore. It's diversity. What key attribute confers stability in governance systems? I think you've guessed the answer, haven't you? It's diversity. It's a diversity of incentives from these 5 different categories interacting with each other. But in the same way as you must have the right species assemblages for a particular ecosystem, it's important to have the right incentives, the appropriate incentives for a particular MPA governance context. So this idea of building a resilient governance framework through a diversity of incentives doesn't just mean that you just throw incentives into the pot to increase the end number. You've got to think about the intelligent design of the interactions between the incentives and what's right for that context. So this is bringing in this, this idea of social-ecological systems finally. So here's our social system, our governed system here, and our ecosystem. This is a paper marine protected area. So it has very few incentives, very heavy impacts, a degraded ecosystem, very low flows of ecosystem services in terms of fisheries, coastal defence value, tourism, etc. So we come along as MPA governors and we strengthen and diversify the governance framework. Great. We've reduced the human impacts Problem, of course, is that there is a time lag of between 3 and 5 years, maybe as much as 35 to 50 years before our ecosystem becomes restored. But eventually the system does become restored, and we have much enhanced flows of ecosystem services from our restored ecosystem, because we have strengthened and made our governance framework more effective. So this is taking this idea of coevolution between the governance system on one hand and the ecosystem on the other, hence the social-ecological systems perspective now coming into our view. So this social-ecological systems perspective sort of broadens this understanding of how this coevolutionary governance concept and how it applies to marine protected areas. But so far it's all been very conceptual. So we tie all this down. This is where the case studies come in. I am ultimately an empiricist. There's been a lot of theory in this talk so far, but all this doesn't have any meaning until we apply it to case studies. So the participants the researchers around the world take this empirical framework and have applied it to 50 marine protected areas. And one of the things they're asked to do is indicate which incentives are used in setting up their MPAs and which are particularly in need of strengthening or introducing to improve effectiveness and equity. And again, I'm not going to go into the detail of it here, but we get a really interesting patterns of these are our 36 incentives along the bottom here, incentive number 1 and incentive number 36. And these are how the incentives are employed but need strengthening or are in need of introducing. So we're getting quite an interesting patterns emerging here. First of all, what we see is some very white columns, incentives that are hardly ever used. And then we see some very green columns, incentives that are used particularly frequently. And again, what I'll do is I'll just give you a snapshot of some of the key findings of this research. So the 27 MPAs, case study specific MPAs in this recent analysis, they tend to use around 18 incentives and particularly need around 7 incentives to be introduced. So roughly speaking, it would seem from these 27 MPAs that around 25 incentives seem to be commonly used or needed. 54% of the used incentives were considered to be particularly important priorities for strengthening. And remember that we also had 7 incentives that were considered priorities for introducing. So these were arguably relatively weak governance frameworks, lacking in diversity and resilience and effectiveness. And this explains the relatively low effectiveness score for these 27 MPAs, which is 1.7 out of 5, which roughly speaking means some impacts are slightly beginning to be addressed, but most impacts currently are not adequately addressed. So these 27 MPAs were on the whole fairly ineffective, but we can still learn a lot from them because we also have case studies of MPAs that have a higher effectiveness. So one of the aims of this work is to see if we can transfer examples of good practice from effective and equitable MPAs, whether we can transfer and adapt those combinations of incentives to improve the effectiveness of other MPAs and their equity. And we also found that 4 incentives are used or needed in all 27 case studies. So, and these make sense because incentive 11 here, raising awareness, people need to be aware of the conservation importance of the area. Incentive 18, capacity for enforcement. There is a need for the restrictions to be adequately enforced to protect the marine resources. Cross-jurisdictional coordination, I mentioned this before, about integrating the functions of different government departments that have functions that can affect a marine protected area, a particularly important incentive in many case studies. And establishing collaborative platforms, the need to provide for the participation of people in reaching decisions that are going to affect them. So these are the 4, if you like, core building blocks that were used or needed in all 27 case studies. And then around them, you build a framework of complementary and interacting incentives. We also calculated the average used rate and average needed rate for incentives in each category. And the essence of this is that if a score of 0 would indicate that no incentives in that category were used in any case study, whilst a score of 1 would indicate that all the incentives in that category were used in all the case studies. So what we found is that communication incentives were most frequently cited as used, whilst legal incentives were most frequently cited as needed. And again, this makes sense because the communication incentives, interpretative incentives, relatively cheap, relatively easy to put in place, and people need to be aware of the conservation importance of the area. They need to be aware of the benefits that can flow from protection, and they need to be aware of the restrictions that have been agreed. So it makes sense that these are most frequently cited as used, but it's interesting that the legal incentives are most frequently cited as needed because of this reinforcement role of legal incentives, but politically it's more challenging to get legal incentives in place, but they are essential as the stability reinforcement rods for any governance framework. So the average used or needed rates indicate that all categories of incentives are both used or needed to varying degrees, with a much more even spread of used or needed rates across the 5 categories of incentives. So again, communication incentives have the highest used or needed rate, followed by legal incentives. But these case studies also show that knowledge, participation, and economic incentives are also frequently identified as used or needed. And this again illustrates the importance of focusing on how a diversity of incentives from different categories can be functionally integrated to combine different governance approaches. But it isn't just about increasing the number and diversity of incentives. It's more about which incentives are appropriate to that MPA. Also, going back to consider how incentives from different categories interact with and support each other, co-evolving and working in combination through functional integration. So all the time, it's this synecology perspective on interactions between incentives. And again, this distinction between the top-down and bottom-up and market approaches becomes blurred, if not irrelevant, because we focus on the cementing role of the 4 of the categories of incentives and the reinforcement role of legal incentives. But they're all important. So the last couple of slides now. In the face of strong driving forces, the combined use of a diversity of functionally integrated incentives makes MPA governance frameworks more resilient. Resilience in MPA governance frameworks is woven through complex webs connecting incentives from all 5 categories. But without strong legal incentives to reinforce the MPA governance framework, it will not be resilient. And this is a conclusion that we've reached through many, many case studies. This is an empirical finding rather than a finding based on any ideology about self-governance and how the state should be retreating. We're finding in these modern times with the pandemic, climate change, biodiversity crisis loss, that the state is probably more important than it ever was, but its role is becoming reconfigured, it's evolving, and this framework tries to capture that reconfiguring and evolving role of the state. And arguing about which category of incentives is most important, whether it's participative, top-down or market, is a bit like arguing about which functional group of species is most important. It's fruitless, because you need all functional groups to make up a diverse, resilient ecosystem. So this work has formed the basis for this guidance published by UNEP. So this is how it's finding its way into practical policy advice. But this paper is much more of an academic output exploring this idea of coevolutionary governance. So the strap line to all this work is diversity is the key to resilience, both of species in ecosystems and incentives in governance systems. This is usually the final sentence of the book, of the UNEP guidance, and of the most recent paper. And I think it's a conclusion that Yoda would approve of. Thank you very much. Questions, please.
Thank you so much, Peter. Particularly like the Yoda reference at the end. Thank you for a really fascinating talk, and you managed to cover a huge amount in that 45 minutes or so. As Peter said, the paper and the reports are available, and we will be making sure those links go out with the recording, and they'll be linked to the recording on the website and on the YouTube channel, so we will make those available to you as well. But if anybody would like to get in touch with Peter, feel free to contact me, I can put you in touch, that's no problem. We have got some questions, so I'm going to firstly go to a comment from Judy, who is asked, could you describe, share the description or the definition of incentives, please? As she was just wanted a bit of clarification on how you're using that term.
I think the term was defined in the presentation. I don't want to go back to the slides now, but incentives they are particular sorts of institution. And let's pause for a moment. What's this word institution? It's a word that's commonly used in this sort of research, which broadly speaking is institutional analysis. And Elinor Ostrom's framework is an example of an institutional analysis framework. And I go along with Elinor Ostrom's definition of an institution. It's any interaction and agreement between humans. So that can be right down from two fishermen on the beach to the people that negotiate the Convention on Biological Diversity. From top to bottom, it's about people reaching agreements, deliberating and reaching agreements. So incentives are a particular subset of institutions that are purposefully, instrumentally designed to try and achieve, in this case, a marine protected areas conservation objectives and ensure that that MPA is also equitable. So incentives are a term that's particularly focused in this framework on particular institutions that have been carefully designed, hopefully carefully designed, to try and support the effective and equitable governance of that MPA. I hope that addresses that uncertainty.
Thank you very much. Okay, going to the Q&A. We've got some comments coming into the comment box, but I'll just go through the Q&A questions first. So a question from Daryl Burden, who said, do you think the natural capital approach could or should be used to improve the governance of MPAs?
I would see the natural capital approach as the natural capital approach is one of the economic incentives. It's actually that incentive number one is payments for ecosystem services. That's kind of like the operationalization of the natural capital approach. And what's fascinating, if you go back to that scatter of how incentives are used or needed or in need of introducing across the 28 case studies, there's one very, very white column to the left of that table. And that's this payment for ecosystem services. So what is really interesting is that there's so much, if you like, ideological and scientific interest in this idea of natural capital. But I think its day is yet to come. It's kind of still an emerging framework. But I personally think that payments for ecosystem services, the likes of Red Plus or Blue Carbon, they can be a very important contributor of funding and of support for a marine protected area. And I would see them, yes, as one of these 36 incentives, but they do also have potentially have problems associated with them. So they're not an instant fix. They can make an important contribution to governance, but what's interesting is so far there's been very little uptake of those payments for ecosystem services for marine protected areas. And where we do have them, they're nearly all on the voluntary carbon market. And this is another talk that I could give. The voluntary carbon market sells carbon too cheaply. You can buy a ton of carbon credits on the voluntary market for $25. The social cost of carbon is at least $75. So potentially they've got a lot to offer, but there's a lot to be done in developing them as realistic and implementable instruments, I think. And we need to make sure that they don't lead themselves to inequities through the imposition, an impositional approach to get those payments for ecosystem services.
Mm-hmm. That's great, thank you. We'll get you back for that other talk another time. There's another question from an anonymous person, but what can we do if governments aren't open to co-governance? We know that stakeholder inclusion in decision-making makes for more equitable MPAs, but not all governments or relevant authorities are willing to work with local communities or in a cross-border way for various reasons. It might be political reasons or resource constraints or a number of challenges around inclusive governance. So how can we kind of address some of those barriers and some of those challenges to effective co-governance?
I think by example, I mean, surely governments that have tried to implement purely top-down approaches, they are aware of these risks of imposition, but hopefully by making more transparent through case studies of where these risks of imposition have become apparent. Most governments are recognizing now that the days of direct command and control are over. You know, we're seeing governments more and more rely on a reconfiguring and evolving role. But where you do have governments that are still trying to dogmatically stick to this very top-down impositional approach, one can only hope that they learn through experience, or the people learn through experience and don't elect them again. But apart from that, I think case studies like this can show that the risks of imposition are real. They're not imagined. It's not my conceptual imagination. So through case studies where risks of imposition have led to problems. But that's not to say that you should give your MPA purely to local people. And I think that makes the message more convenient for governments, because you're saying we're not ending the role of you in steering this MPA. You're not relinquishing control to local people, because arguably that would be irresponsible of the state, because marine biodiversity is a collective resource. But what we can do is say, well, you can also bring in participative approaches. The economic approaches are important. So you sell the idea of resilience, effectiveness, and equity through diversity, and hopefully they get the fact that it's also more politically acceptable and sustainable, socially sustainable.
And I think in some cases we're moving into a space where that kind of participatory approach and that engagement with people and with communities is much more commonplace than it maybe was 10, 20 years ago. It's part of the conversation.
But also people are becoming more accepting of the fact that whilst their participation is being provided for, there will be certain challenges or certain free riders, if I can use that term, where state regulation will need to step in. So yes, I think there's growing awareness of this idea that we need to combine different approaches. And I guess that's one of my missions through this research is to broaden recognition that it isn't about bottom up or top down. It's about how we can combine all these governance approaches.
Do those together. We've had hopefully a relatively simple question, which is just wondering why there were no case studies from the US and its territories, and was that for a particular reason?
It's interesting, the US, because we had 2 case studies in the original sample of 20, the National Marine Sanctuaries in the US and the California Marine Reserves, but they absolutely refused to ground the analysis in specific case studies. So at the risk, I'm straying into risky ground here, but there seems to be a reluctance amongst American researchers to critically question, as well as constructively question, but there seems to be a reluctance to say, okay, let's do both a constructive and critical analysis. Many US MPA researchers just seem to look at me and say, well, we do it right. We're American. So there did seem to be some sort of cultural reluctance to put their MPAs forward to be sort of critically and constructively analysed. But we do have one case study in Great South Bay, which is interestingly one of the few private MPAs that we have in the sample. And I personally am very keen to fill that gap. So if there are any US researchers out there on MPAs that would like to apply this framework, and I'm more than happy to work with you. The way that we've gathered these 50 case studies has been quite organic. People contact me invariably and say, I want to use your framework, PhD students, master students, researchers, and then they become entrained in the MPAG project. Lots of interaction with them and guidance with them. So yes, please, I'm very open to US case studies that we can include in our sample.
That's great to know. And so if anybody's watching the recording that wasn't able to attend today's session and you want to get in touch with Peter, again, just let us know and we can make that connection. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Always happy to kind of foster that collaboration. So there's a question from Julia Bingham who said, what can we do in situations where there is a source of friction, which may be social or political or something else, between the top-down and the bottom-up frameworks that could present a challenge of power or create a barrier to building those coevolutionary approaches that you've explored? So to put an example, in a case where sovereignty is contested or there is a legacy of colonialism, which we might see in settler states or around indigenous communities, and how do you kind of address that friction and that contestation?
I mean, power is problematic. It can create major bottlenecks, problems for governance. Power is also a slippery concept. It's one of the reasons I don't work with political ecology, because it all revolves around this idea of power. And as soon as you think you've got a hold of power, it slips out your hand and you realize it's somebody else has got them. So this idea of who has the power and who doesn't, it can be problematic. But let's focus in on that specific example of indigenous communities. And I'm an enthusiastic supporter of this idea that protected areas, not just marine protected areas, should build on indigenous institutions. Indeed, it's one of our key participative incentives, that you build on local customs. I actually think that with protected areas, including MPAs, we should work with indigenous peoples. Usually they're practices that have evolved over millennia, are sustainable, they're based on rich traditional ecological knowledge, but nor are indigenous peoples unaffected by market economics and materialist aspirations. So it's important to, I mean, I can't address those power imbalances. One of the things that we often do through these analyses is end up shining the torch back at the state and saying, you're the problem. You know, the way that you're implementing these regulations, the way that you're not recognizing customary institutions is the problem. So sometimes the critical mirror shines on the people, but more often than not, it shines back up at the state and you're saying, you're the problem. And I sometimes wonder why this framework isn't popular, but you know, at the end of the day, we just try and analyze case studies. One of those challenges, I agree, can be this state tyranny of the state, if you like. But all you can do is say, well, this is a problematic case study, and you need to reform the way that you're working.
Mm-hmm. And there's maybe a slight linked question is what about when there are conflicts between the private sector and local communities, and how should the government help, or what's the role of the government in coordinating that relationship? And the question's been asked by someone who's included an example of the Seychelles economy, which is dominated by luxury tourism, which we'll all be quite aware of, but which could hinder and pose challenges to the participation of local communities within marine governance and their own needs and priorities. So the question is, what's the role of the government in trying to manage that conflict?
We have 2 Seychelles marine parks included in this sample, including two of them are in this special section. So I completely agree with the person that asked that question. The Seychelles MPAs were particularly problematic because of, this is a recognized problem that the corporate tourism sector sometimes captures the state, or a term that we use is that they work in an unholy alliance with the state. So the corporate tourism sector and its hunger to get into areas and sometimes hijack local governance processes, and in doing so undermine effectiveness and often also equity. That's one of the challenges that a combination of incentives should be able to help address. But where it is this unholy alliance between the state and tourism corporations, again, all you can do is identify it and shine a light on it and say, this is the problem. You need to have more community-driven tourism development. The community needs to be more involved in the decisions about tourism development. And I think, yes, in that case, you'd be saying you need to strengthen your participative approaches, including the participative development of tourism. Tourism can develop in a number of different ways, but invariably it seems to go down this corporate tourism route, and a lot of the profits leak out to corporate incomers. So one of the ideas behind this notion of ecotourism, which in another presentation we could unpack through this framework, is a way of making tourism more eco, and that means more effective and more equitable. But I agree, the Seychelles marine parks are particularly problematic in that respect, which is why I sometimes wonder why, because they've got these debt for nature swaps, all of a sudden, in our neoliberal enthusiasm, everything in the Seychelles is rosy. But in fact, what are in effect payments for ecosystem services don't appear to be having much benefit for these inshore, busy, conflicted marine parks. So again, I would refer you to the two papers that are in the special section. If you can't access them, drop me a line and I'll email them to you.
That's great. Thanks, Peter. And I suppose, as you said, if you're highlighting the challenges and maybe what's not working as effectively for a particular MPA, what you kind of need within the governing institutions is those champions that will push forward that kind of co-evolutionary approach, don't you? You need the people that will kind of drive forward the institutional shift, a changing way of thinking.
And that's, I mean, you mentioned champions. One of our cross-cutting themes is the role of leadership. And one thing that we have found is that individuals can be, can make a tremendous difference. They're often different to reproduce. I often go back to one of the examples from the early case studies, Chumba in Zanzibar, and people say, well, how do you reproduce the Chumba model? And it's like, oh, you need lots of civil reed millers, and there aren't many of those. So, but those champions, the leadership role can be important. But again, the idea of this sort of fairly frank and open way of analysing governance is, regardless of where the weaknesses and problems are, it will identify them and say, well, other case studies have had this problem, and here's a combination of incentives that, this problem is not insurmountable. But two words that I haven't used yet are political will. And probably in these last few minutes of this webinar, people often ask me, you've got this typology or this menu of 36 incentives. What's the single most important ingredient in the mix? And I always say it's political will. So political will, not only to avoid these tyrannies of the state, unholy alliances, but because you need political will to get those vital legal incentives, not put in bluntly and without that sort of embeddedness and negotiation and adaptation. You would need to have the state on board, otherwise they can become potentially a sponsor through unholy alliances of conflicting activities. So what's the single most important ingredients in this co-evolutionary governance perspective on governance? It's probably political will. And that's where these Aichi targets and the successes to the Aichi targets can become very important. But we need to ensure that the political will to achieve these targets for effective networks of MPAs don't themselves create equity problems. So it's political will not just for effectiveness, but also the neglected part of the Aichi target, which is equity.
Yeah, and I think the conversations are really moving around how we take account of equity and social justice and kind of inclusivity across these kind of governance approaches. We're just coming up to nearly 1:10, so I'm going to pose the final question I think that I've seen, which is, do you believe national government need to implement more research into their MPAs, and should MPA governance research be local for local people to assess?
I mean,
we all want more money for more research.
People should be involved in MPA governance research, but I think that we do need more systematic approaches to analysing MPA governance. And I know from my own experience that if there are other frameworks out there, that I've mentioned one of them, social-ecological systems, but it's not the only other framework. But I've tried using all of them, which is why I ended up saying, okay, we'll design our own, but from the bottom up through empirical research. So I do think that there need to be more systematic analyses of MPA governance, analyses that aren't blinkered by advocacy for one governance approach or another, whether it's participation or market or the role of the state. And to that end, we're always open to more case studies, but yes, that research should always be working with local people. And I haven't mentioned the methodologies behind this, but most of the research has become really immersed in their case studies, ethnographic studies, ethically working with local people, finding out what their hopes and aspirations and views are, and then analysing it and sharing those findings with local people. So yeah, working with local people is important, but I do think that we need to have some sort of, a systematic, reproducible empirical approach that we can replicate in other case studies, so that we can start comparing all these case studies, which again is what we're trying to do through this project.
Yeah, and Lucy just clarified what she meant was that it should be public for local people to assess. And I guess you kind of commented on that just at the end, where you said that the information should be shared with local communities, and that should be part of that process.
Yeah, one of our incentives is very important. I mean, they're all important, but one of the important incentives is transparency, openness, and fairness. And if I had more time to talk about this, I'd say, well, the state is accountable to the people, and the people are accountable to the state. It's kind of like a two-way checks and balances approach. One of the things I find interesting is that we all work within marine protected areas or natural resource governance. But when I talk about my research to people that do research on governance in education or health, they're amazed that we're still saying bottom up is best, because they say it's all about combining the approaches, but then having mutual checks and balances. Yeah, transparency, openness, and fairness. Another of one of the 36 important incentives.
All important.
All important.
All important.
You can see how obsessed I am with all this. That's one of our case studies behind me. That's a map of Shark Bay in Western Australia. One of the only case studies that I've analysed entirely myself. So that's a measure of my immersion in all this. And I hope you found this introduction to the concept of coevolutionary governance interesting. Again, I would urge you to have a look at the paper. Hopefully I've whet your appetite this afternoon. Have a look at the paper, look at the supplementary material. If you've got the appetite for it, there's 19 case study papers. And if you're interested in using this framework for an MPA, whether it's your MSc, PhD, or your practitioners, please drop me a line, and I'll be very happy to work with you to add further case studies to our sample.
Thank you so much, Peter, and thank you to everybody who joined for today. I think the talk's been fantastic for anybody interested in MPA governance, but governance more generally, and also just how we think about how we're managing our ocean and marine and coastal resources. I think it's been a fantastic session, so thank you so much. You've also kind of volunteered to give about 3 more talks, which is great. Have you back anytime. But thank you all so much for joining this afternoon. There will be another MarSocSci webinar in April. I can't quite remember the date, but keep an eye out on the newsletter. We'll have information out on that in the next couple of weeks. We will, as I said, the recording will be made available on YouTube in the next couple of days, with all the links that Peter's mentioned, so the links to the papers and the supplementary material as well. And if you want to be put in touch and you for whatever reason can't contact Peter, do let me know, and I will make sure to make
you go to mpag.info, mpag.info. That links through to my email address. And also I'd like to thank Emma for the opportunity today. Much appreciated working with you on the MarSocSci network. Thank you for elevating the status of MarSocSci.
Oh, thanks. Well, glad to have you along, and it's been great to have so many fantastic speakers and such a great set of questions today as well. So I will let everybody go to their lunch breaks. Thank you very much again, and I hope to see you soon. Thanks everyone. Take care. Bye.